Well, greetings to our Pilgrim Church family, and welcome as well to any visitors we might have online here. Danny here for the Shepherds at Pilgrim Church of Christ with the Tuesday, August 11th dose. Should be able to remember that date very easily because that is my beautiful wife's birthday. So, if you watched last week's dose that I posted, you know that we're looking at the book of James, and that last week I covered the first two chapters, and this week I'm going to cover the last three chapters. The theme of this study is the 5 marks of a mature Christian as presented by James. And last week we looked at the first two. The first mark from chapter 1 was the patience in testing, and verse 12 was our text passage. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been proved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Then we moved on to chapter 2 for the second mark of a mature Christian, that being living out his or her faith. And our text passage was verse 17 of chapter 2. Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. As I said, we're going to pick up with chapter 3 and move on through the last three chapters to cover the last 3 marks. If you have not seen last week's post, I would recommend that you stop this one, search for last week's, and view it, because it will lead right into what we're studying here, and will also help you understand how this all relates together throughout the entire book. And then when you come back, we'll pick up here with chapter 3. So, picking up with chapter 3. Looking at the marks of a mature Christian according to James. James says in chapter 3, the third mark of a mature Christian is the exhibiting power over the tongue. Chapter 3 of James is one of the more familiar passages, has some very interesting comments and references about the tongue, which really hit home for a lot of us, I'm sure. James says that in chapter 3 that there are 3 basic powers of our tongue. The first one is the power to direct, and he compares that with how a horse can be directed with a bit in its mouth, or how a huge ship can be directed with a small rudder at the end. The second power of the tongue, he says, is the power to destroy, and he compares that to a wildfire or to a wild animal. And then the third power that James talks about of the tongue is the power to delight. And he compares that with a fountain of fresh water or a very bountiful fruit tree. But these contrasting consequences of how we choose to use our tongues are all represented in one verse in chapter 3, and that's verse 10, where we are told, quote, out of the same mouth proceed blessings and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so, unquote. Moving on to chapter 4, we find James presents the fourth mark of a mature Christian as one who strives to be a peacemaker. In James' time, just like in ours today, people warred against each other. They warred with themselves, and they warred with God. And we are told that the answer to these wars is not just to be a lover of peace, but to go a step beyond that and to actually seek peace. To seek peace with others, to seek peace with ourselves, and to seek peace with God. This is wrapped up in verses 7 through 10, where an extract of that tells us, quote, therefore submit to God, draw near to God, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up, unquote. Then moving to the last chapter, chapter 5, James winds up his letter with a mark of a mature Christian, number 5, being praying in troubles. James concludes this compact little letter by addressing the troubles that Christians always have and still do and always will face in our lives. Economic troubles, physical troubles, national troubles, even church troubles. Interesting that James hits on these areas, and those stand out so starkly in the news and the reports that we hear still today. But for all of these troubles, James offers one remedy that's consistent with all of those, And that remedy is prayer. We know that Satan would have us to become impatient and have us to give up on God. And even though that's the case, our Father has promised and still promises that if we remain faithful to Him, He will remain faithful and He will reward us for our endurance. In the latter part of chapter 5 and verse 16, we read, quote, "The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much." And I would go expound, that's the word I'm trying to find. I would expound on that a little bit when he says a righteous man. I believe that would refer to human beings. So a righteous man or a righteous woman, their effective prayers avail much. And I can testify that I have seen that be true in both men and women whom I have admired and whose prayers have been very beneficial in many aspects. Okay, so we have looked at the 5 marks of a mature Christian according to James: patience in testing, living out our faith, exhibiting power over the tongue, striving to be a peacemaker, and praying in troubles. And I pray that each of us individually and all of us collectively, whether in our small personal families, in our extended church family, that we would all practice these teachings according to what James presents. They would not only make our individual Christian lives a fuller life, they'll also help to strengthen the entire church body and influence for good the world around us. Before I close out, I want to go back to chapter 2 for one last comment. I'm continuing to be amazed at how, no matter how many times you open God's Word, there's always something there that, because of the situation at the time you were reading, studying, a recent event, something that's been recently bothering you in your mind or your heart or your soul, that there's always something that speaks to you. And about a year ago, I was scheduled to present the communion thoughts at our worship service, and I had all my outline worked out, and I was kind of pondering that in the back of my mind while I was doing my daily Bible reading before I left for Sunday school. And it happened that that particular day, the daily Bible reading was the 2nd chapter of James. When I got down to verse 13, I read one little short passage there that just, I did not remember having read it before. And when I read it that day, it just really struck me very strongly. And I've turned to that passage many times since then. He talks about our living out our faith, as we said in chapter 2, and then toward the end here, he says, or actually it's right in the middle, he says, the last sentence of verse 13, mercy triumphs over judgment. Wow, what a comforting thought. And if you think about it, that, in a nutshell, is the gospel. Mercy triumphs over judgment, because true judgment would call for each of us in our sinful state to be condemned. But through God's love and compassion, He expresses mercy through the sacrifice of His Son, giving His body and giving His blood, that we might be washed clean, that He might pay the price for our sin. God's mercy triumphs over what would have been God's judgment. I pray that tonight's study, today's study, it is tonight right now, but whatever part-time of day it is you're seeing this, I pray that this study has interested you and even more so benefited you, and will spur you to turn to James and do a little bit more in-depth study than what I've done here with just a little brief outline, because James is one of those books that you can't study enough, one of 66 of them actually. But appreciate you tuning in, and I wish you health and happiness, safety. I know many of you are facing some difficult times, having to contain your association with others Some of you even have COVID, an outbreak in your families, one or more individuals. Some of you are facing serious health issues. Whatever the case may be, I wish God's blessings on you all, and look forward to speaking with you again next week. Pray that you'll be able to come out, worship with us Sunday, study with us in Bible class, and worship with us. If not, keep in mind we always have the online access available, and hope you can make use of that. God bless you. Take care. I love every one of you, and we'll talk to you later.